Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to today's Medical Center Hour. I'm Marcia Day Childress from the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities here in the School of Medicine. Delighted to see all of you here today, including those of you who have come from buildings outside the Medical Center where it's frightfully cold today. So thank you for braving the elements. Our program today is Eros and Illness, a Caregiver's Tale. The caregiver, whether a family member pressed into service or an underpaid home care aide, is a representative figure of our time. The status is paradoxical because actual caregivers, so often female, do their work largely out of sight, almost in secret. The caregiver is an uncanny representative figure whom we do not see. Writer and scholar David Morris spent over a decade as a caregiver for his late wife, Ruth, a medical librarian who in her mid-50s began to show signs of what was most likely early onset Alzheimer's dementia. In this presentation, he describes his experience, but also uses his personal caregiving as a fulcrum for opening up larger questions about what biomedicine often overlooks in its molecular vision of illness. Desire is the neglected force that Professor Morris sees as basic to illness, and it is the role of desire in illness that he seeks to clarify. Desire, he further suggests, offers unanticipated common ground where healthcare professionals, who of course are caregivers too in their medical roles, may meet with patients and families in mutual, richer understanding. Desire, as we will see, played a powerful and multifaceted role in Professor Morris's experience as a caregiver, experience that implicated him deeply in questions he'd long engaged as a writer and in the classroom. So while his new book, Eros and Illness, just out last month from Harvard University Press, can be seen to have grown quite organically out of his prior scholarship and teaching, it is even more deeply anchored in his relationship with his late wife, his care for her, and the difficult, demanding, and devoted journey they made together to the end of her life just last year. Now, David Morris is actually known well to many of us. He's our former colleague here at UVA and in the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities. As a scholar and writer, he's highly respected nationwide and worldwide in fields as diverse as medical humanities, 18th century literary studies, pain studies, and environmental studies. We know him too to be a teacher of great intellectual dexterity, compassion, and commitment. In the seminar room, as in his books, his interdisciplinarity dazzles, his intellectual curiosity inspires, and his ways of reading everything from classical literature to popular culture are always original and instructive, and often paradigm shifting. Finally, a personal note. David Morris and I have known each other for a full 47 years. I counted today. He's been my colleague, my friend, and in a profound way, he's been my teacher. I have learned from him and his work every step of the way in my personal and professional journeys, and I'm learning from him still. Like many of my colleagues in medicine and the English department, I also knew Ruth Cohen Morris and delighted in her intelligence, her zest for life, and the vital partnership that she and David so enjoyed. It's a remarkable act of love that David Morris has lived out in wrestling with Eros and illness, and in writing this wise and provocative book, which he dedicated to Ruth. Welcome, David. How very, very good it is to have you here.
All you can say after an introduction like that is, wow. Thank you, Marcia. And in some ways, this talk will be just a footnote to the introduction. The introduction said a lot. John, maybe we could dim the lights a little bit, and that's maybe perfect. And I hope planning that there'll be time for questions afterward. What I found is that my heroes and heroines in healthcare know already everything I'm going to say. But sometimes we need the right language to formulate what it is we know. And perhaps that's the most I can hope to do here. Anyway, thanks to Marcia Childress, who's been the guiding spirit of Medical Center Hour, which has been an enormous addition to the educational mission of the university, the Center for Bioethics and Humanities, and indeed to the School of Medicine. And I'm excited for an opportunity to talk about the book because it's really just a pup. It hasn't been out for a whole month yet. There have been no reviews to trample the snow, so I still have it in a kind of honeymoon period where I can think about it exactly and only what I want to. The lecture and the book are both dedicated to my late wife, Ruth, and so it's an honor to dedicate this talk to her. The way you know someone is from the humanities as opposed to straight from medical school is that they start with an epigraph. And I'm no different. And Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts is my new favorite book. It's a wonderful primer on the fluidity of gender identification and the malleability of erotic experience. It also contains the best description of childbirth I've ever encountered, and makes me momentarily proud to be a member of the patriarchy and not to had to actually live through it as more than a participant observer. At any rate, I think it's a rhetorical question, but we'll come back to it. Is it not idle to fault a net for having holes? As a sort of roadmap to where we'll be today, what I'm going to be talking about is illness as a lived experience and my lived experience as a caregiver as part of it. I want to ask some basic questions about the book. We'll also be doing 2 5-minute readings that you might want to think of as rest stops and might be otherwise a long journey. And then a conclusion in which I'll say something about the argument of the book, but the argument may be the least important part of it. So let me come back to Maggie Nelson's comment about nets having holes. If you want to understand the lived experience of illness, which is my interest in the book, what tools do you use? And for me, the appropriate tool at hand is narrative. And what you have to say instantly is that narrative has got holes in it. It's the nature of narrative that there are gaps, there are indeterminacies, there are conflicts of interpretation. 2 equally intelligent people can come to different views of a narrative. That's the nature of the tool that you're using. It has holes. But it may be the only tool or the right tool in which to investigate the lived experience of illness. Now, I owe you some kind of a definition of what I mean by narrative, and so I'd invoke Richard Kearney here, where he talks about the narrative as having the common function of someone telling something to someone about something. And I don't want to get any more technical than that. I think that says it all, but it also suggests why narrative would be an intrinsic part of the clinical encounter, where someone is always telling something to someone about something. This is a functional definition, but my preference for a concept like this is to be as functional as possible. The lived experience of illness is something I discovered I've been interested in for a long time, actually, but not knowing that's exactly what I was interested in. So an occasion like this is a very helpful reflection for me. But what ties these 3 books together, which I now think of as a kind of weird trilogy, an unintended trilogy, is that they all have what I call a biocultural approach. That is, they understand illness as always having a biological substrate, and so honoring those people who work in bench science and clinics and are dealing with the biological aspect of illness. But illness also has a cultural component, a personal component, a psychological component, and for me, the trick is to try to figure out how to bring these 2 together. And I think that's what's been the common thread of this fairly long journey. When I did the math about the time lapse between books, I realized that my next book is due out when I'm 104 years old. So I'm hoping this may actually end as a trilogy. So let me do some basic questions. What is it? What is the book? And it is a work of narrative nonfiction, is the most succinct description. And yet I would also add this sort of subcategory of braided narrative nonfiction. So what do I mean by that? Well, it braids together what I would call first-person accounts with third-person accounts. Again, a kind of a biocultural convergence. So in the first-person accounts, we have multiple subjectivities. First, my own particular lived experience as a caregiver, and then the experience of others who were reporting in the first person. So people who write memoirs or other illness narratives. So we have both the self and other who are speaking from a first-person point of view. And then I'm always trying to link these with what is known and knowable from the biomedical community and beyond. So for me, linked issues include a chapter on pain and a chapter on light, and even the largest risk, I take a central chapter on the nudes of the modernist poet Modigliani. So what it's about, the premise is, and picking up on Susan Sontag's remark, that everyone holds a dual citizenship, both in the kingdom of the well and the kingdom of the sick. So that illness has always transported us to another kingdom, but there's a problem. And that is that the kingdom has changed. It's changed over the last, say, 200 years. And when we fall ill today, we fall under the sway of a near monolithic sovereign power called, for short, biomedicine. I'm not attempting to create a straw man out of biomedicine, but as a state authorized and state funded system that spans oceans, it's a major part of what happens to anyone when we fall ill today. So this leads me to the question of what does biomedicine, with what has now become this sort of new tool of a molecular vision that can look into our own DNA, what does it miss? And what does it in fact choose to ignore in order to do the work that it needs to do? And my answer in Eros and Illness, as Marcia has pointed out, is desire. Desire seems to me one of the almost ineradicable parts of the lived experience of illness, but one that biomedicine has difficulty acknowledging and dealing with. Conclusion, Eros and Illness is about desire, and that would be my closest one-word description of what I mean by Eros. I mean desire in patients and in families, and particularly in healthcare professionals, where it's, again, too easily ignored, I think. And that desire is the unseen, forgotten, neglected power. We have to question to understand the various lived experiences of illness, and I absolutely pluralize that as experiences. I'm not suggesting that there is one universal or archetypal experience of illness, but what does seem to me consistent is that experience has something to do with desire, and desire will change its shape. It's a real shapeshifter. Well, I need to give you a description of Eros. And 1986 was the banner year for Eros. Both Anne Carson and Georges Bataille have these important books. For Anne Carson, it's Eros, the Bittersweet, and she picks the epithet for Eros used by Sappho, which is actually literally translated as sweet bitter or bittersweet, and that for Eros there has to be this combination. Eros can turn bitter in a second, as probably most of us know, but it also has a kind of sweetness that for most of us keeps us coming back. So that's an intrinsic part of Eros. And then I had to work out my own kind of diagram as to what I think Eros could include. And it doesn't include just romantic love, but it can include lust separated from any notion of romance. It, I think for many people, has to include acts of empathy, but on the other hand, I think there can be a violence that's also part of Eros that is always needs to be kept in mind, that Eros has this possibility of turning violent. And my diagram is meant to suggest that there's violence that has nothing to do with the erotic. So I'm going to always be talking about medical Eros and medical logos, and medical Eros is the kind of tension Eros that needs to happen within the healthcare community. And there are worlds of Eros that other people are better situated than I am to understand, explore, to talk about. But the diagram leaves a couple of questions lingering. How does Eros differ from sexual activity? And here Georges Bataille is my go-to guy. That sexual reproductive activity is common to sexual animals and men, but only men, or we would say only humans, appear to have turned their sexual activity into erotic activity. So there's a connection between sexual activity and erotic activity, but the erotic activity is a particular human inflection of some kind of sexual base. And what's distinctive about human erotic activity, again, Bataille nails it for me, that human eroticism differs from animal sexuality precisely in this, that it calls inner life into play. So it's that inner life of lived experience that is of particular interest to me. As a caregiver, caregiving itself, the most trivial description of it would be some kind of material action that is carried out, although caregivers do that day and night. But it's the interiority of caregiving that for me is the mark of it. Well, this leads me to the first rest stop. And if I might, I will just read for 5 minutes to give a little sense of what the book is about and also to flesh out some of what I've said. Eros is central not only to love, its traditional domain, but also to illness. This crucial relationship, however, goes mostly unrecognized and unaddressed, with incalculable harm to patients, to doctors, and to loved ones. The importance of Eros in illness proved an unavoidable, unwelcome fact in my own experience as I gradually came to recognize that I was living in a condition of conflict, almost like a civilian in a war zone, caught between two mighty forces that, lacking an established vocabulary, I came to call medical logos and medical Eros. The conflict turned weirder than any ordinary combat because although medical logos is highly visible and almost inescapable, medical Eros remains largely unseen, living in the shadows as if its distinctive superpowers included a cloak of invisibility. The conflict and the terms I invented in order to describe it are both unfamiliar enough to require a brief preliminary account. So everything changed with the blessing of the candles. Something awful was going on after months of untethered suspicion as dishes turned up in random cabinets and a mislaid exercise rope triggered meltdown rages. I couldn't any longer take refuge in excuses. The secular Jewish family I married into blessed the candles only on Passover, and the traditional prayer always fell to Ruth. With the grace of a natural-born dancer fully blossomed into her 50s, flanked by family and by her closest friends, she stretched her hands above the lighted candles, eyes closed, palms down, elbows raised, as she had done since childhood. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Ruth's almost trance-like state as she re-enters this ritual space visibly softens the edge that served her well as a mid-level administrator, as if the ancient blessing draws her into a deeper order of time and being. After 25 Sederim together, I know the sounds and rhythms almost as well as the hymns from my childhood. I always feel a reassuring warmth as Ruth sings the blessing. It seems to affirm a pre-verbal bond that connects us in a closeness that friends marvel at, much as touches, sighs, and glances count for more among lovers than words and meanings. On this night, now forever different from all other nights, with Ruth's hands floating palms down above the white tapers, her face serene, her skin glowing in the candlelight, I turn stone cold as she stumbles over the opening phrases. Impossible. She can't remember. I'm repeating the familiar Hebrew syllables in my head as if to help her to jog her memory, but this, I sense, is no normal forgetting. I've read enough popular neuroscience to suspect that you don't ordinarily forget patterns so deep, but I still don't know what's going on. All at once, I'm knee-deep in the not known. There must be severe damage, a powerful synaptic disorder. Ruth's halting and peculiarly unmelodic contralto accent only adds to my well-mannered, unnoticed dinner table panic. I have no idea about the nightmare ahead. I feel confused and blindsided, as if masked, black-clad troops are sliding down ropes to land on our roof in a surprise assault. So, how to bring this into a larger context? I was really drawn by this essay by Smith and Christakis that talks about supradyadic networks. And I'm kind of using it for my own purposes here, but the traditional dyad is a doctor-patient dyad. And you might expand it slightly to include one spouse. But what Smith and Christakis are interested in a more contemporary way is this, what they call these supradyadic networks, in which you have not only the doctor and the patient, but the patient's friend and the friend of the friend, and they're all connected electronically. And in fact, for Christakis, Smith and Christakis, this helps account for how obesity spreads through social networks. I have my skeptical moments in thinking about that claim, but I do like this notion that we're now living in an era of supradyadic networks. And for me, the caregiver stands as a figure in this supradyadic concept of illness. Caregiver too is, interestingly, by taking that position, is at risk. First of all, there are a lot of us. My guess is possibly even in the auditorium, or we all know someone who's actively caregiving. That there is, in fact, a value of unpaid labor in this particular workforce, but also increased risk for heart disease, arthritis, cancer, etc., twice the rate of depression. I can't resist this because this is me, those are my legs, heading to my angiogram in Darwin, Australia, which is as far north as you can go in Australia without standing in the Sea of Timor. This was my first week away from Ruth as a caregiver. She had gotten to the stage of Alzheimer's disease where patients no longer recognize family members, and it had an oddly liberating function for me because I could finally accept an invitation to go to Australia to be the keynote speaker for National Pain Week in Australia, something I longed to do, longed to be able to accept. So after doing my week's work in Sydney, I blew my honorarium on a tour of Australia, ended up in the north, and with a heart attack. It never occurred to me then that the heart attack was exactly the part of the risk factor that I had incurred in caregiving. I can't prove it, but the dots are there, and that's certainly how I connected. How is the caregiver a representative figure representing this larger supradyad? Some of this, Marcia has in fact suggested that they represent both that supradyadic aspect, but also the biocultural aspect of illness in which the caregiver becomes ill in the process of taking care of the patient. That is, patienthood has suddenly expanded beyond the single person. What I'd like to do for a moment, since I'm a big fan of evidence-based medicine, I honestly don't want to see a primary care physician who operates only on whim. I really like to see some evidence, but I also need to see some evidence behind this notion that desire is important. So there are a few key texts that I'll take a look at just to give you a sense. And if we think of Eros as the bittersweet and imagine the danger involved in it, this classic short story by William Carlos Williams, The Use of Force, is probably the test case for the way Eros can go wrong in a medical encounter. Williams' physician is administering an oral throat exam, but something is going on in the patient-doctor relationship that isn't strictly medical at this point. He's somehow, this is quoting his words, falling in love with a girl who's resisting the exam, and it gets worse. I too had got beyond reason. I could have torn the child apart in my own fury and enjoyed it. There is always the potential of Eros to turn violent, and one of the reasons for, I think, articulating desire as a central feature in the medical encounter is to be aware of those moments in which desire can turn violent, needs to be in some sense quarantined for the good of the patient. Anatole Broyard was, for the long time, book review editor of the Sunday New York Times, and he diagnosed with prostate cancer. Has this absolutely counterintuitive response in an essay he calls Intoxicated by My Illness. When my friends heard I had cancer, they found me surprisingly cheerful and talked about my courage, but it has nothing to do with courage. It's a question of desire. I'm filled with desire to live, to write, to do everything I now feel as concentrated as a diamond or a microchip. I found other writers who are saying something of the same thing about the diagnosis with potentially life-threatening illness, that it does not necessarily evoke courage as the emotion as desire. This becomes part of the inner life of illness. A favorite figure of mine, the physician Rafael Campo, his book, The Desire to Heal, I think highlights in his title what brings a great many young people into medicine in the first place, is desire. It is not some kind of rational calculation that goes on, but some sort of commitment to the help of others that isn't strictly explainable on rational grounds alone. But Campo begins his life as a closeted gay doctor, and so his inner life is in some sense constricted, and he's aware of that. Part of his work involves the HIV ward in San Francisco, where he meets a male to female transsexual whom he just calls Aurora, and in the process of his care of Aurora, she begins to die. Her face stripped of all her glittery makeup, expressing a deeply subterraneous pain. Frantic, Campo listens to her heart and lungs. I heard my own stifled desire surface for air in my long sobs. His caregiving as physician is not only care of the patient, but turns out actually to be care of the self. That it's this moment that becomes really transitional for him as he, through Aurora, moves, in fact, to accept his identity as a gay Latino doctor, and he says everything he does thereafter is in some ways hearing her voice, feeling her hands. Audre Lorde describes herself as a black lesbian feminist poet. It's almost like in the game of patriarchy, that's 4 strikes and you're out. But she revels in some ways in that position. But in her encounter as a breast cancer patient, what she discovers, in fact, is not the care that she gets from the medical community. That's certainly not what she emphasizes in the cancer journals, but rather the support that she gets from the other women who become part of her circle. Perhaps I can say all this more simply. I say the love of women healed me. And healing doesn't mean she didn't eventually succumb to breast cancer, but it can be an act that can take place in the process of experiencing a serious illness. And probably what might come first to mind to most of us is the AIDS epidemic. How to think about the AIDS memorial quilt, I like to think of it as in some ways the defining artifact of late 20th century. And it expresses to me the way in which HIV/AIDS is undeniably biocultural. There's the underlying virus that needs to be treated with various kinds of antiretroviral. Let me just elide that with various drugs. And then there's the cultural aspect that we all know about, that we can start with Larry Kramer and the kind of resistance in the gay movement to what was the denial that was going on in the Reagan administration. For me, the real eye-opener was this book called 28 Stories of AIDS in Africa. All I knew about HIV/AIDS was based on really an American model. In Africa, the model is very different, although desire and eros underlie it absolutely. Stephanie Nolan was a journalist, and 28 means that she is writing one story for each of the 28 million people. So for 1 million people, she writes one story. There were 28 million people at that time diagnosed with HIV/AIDS in Africa. So again, the biocultural nature of illness means that we recognize in some ways that we are all culturally situated, and the experience of illness will change very much depending on where that situation is. In Africa, in small villages, when the young parents were dead of HIV/AIDS, often called SLIM or the wasting disease in Africa, the traditional village recourse would be for the grandmothers to care for the orphans. The village would fill up with orphans. The grandmothers couldn't possibly carry the burden, so that the structure of village life, in fact, was completely altered. At any rate, these would be my 5 representative bits of evidence. And let me offer another 5-minute rest. Caregivers, no less than the patients they care for, pass through the fires. They stand no less in need of attachment, emergence, and self-transformation. After 30 years of marriage and a decade as caregiver, I needed plenty of help. Mostly, given my solitary habits, help was absent. I was left alone to decide, it was the hardest day of my life, when it was time for Ruth to leave the home we had built together. She could no longer make decisions. It was all left to me. When I asked for help from her all-star medical center team, her neurologist replied coolly from the far side of Logos, quote, "Not a medical issue," unquote. Many caregivers know the unthinkable bitterness of leaving a loved one behind. The distress is almost mythic, evoking for me memories of Eurydice disappearing into the underworld. A miraculous recovery and reunion was what I desired. Ruth's return to health and to the restoration of our life together. What I discovered instead was the inescapability of loss and failure. Psyche is a young princess so beautiful that even Venus, the goddess of love, envies her. Fired with resentment toward a mere human rival, Venus sends her wayward son Cupid to afflict Psyche. But not even Cupid, it turns out, is safe from Eros. The beauty of Psyche proves so enchanting that Cupid too falls hopelessly in love. After numerous improbable twists, they marry. Their fairy tale marriage, however, includes an ironclad proviso. Psyche, as mortal, is not allowed to gaze upon her winged god husband. Hence they meet only after dark. Psyche, alas, falls for a plot devised by her evil sisters, and one evening she lights an oil lamp to gaze secretly at her sleeping husband. The vision so dazzles her that unluckily a drop of lamp oil falls on Cupid's shoulder. He wakes, sees that she has broken the marriage provision, and without a word flies off. The myth of Cupid and Psyche has an equally improbable happy ending, a reunion and remarriage ordered by Jupiter, but the Deus Ex Machina happy ending gets less happy the more I think about it. In the common version, Psyche lies worn out and near death from years of futile searching when Cupid suddenly reappears. He revives her with a famous kiss that both saves her life and confers immortality. It is this moment of erotic transformation that neoclassical sculptor Antonio Canova captures in a marble embrace so fluid it seems lifelike. As if its eroticism were too dangerous to accept outside the sanitizing process of allegory, various Neoplatonic writers interpreted the passion that Canova celebrates as expressing the soul's desire for union with the divine. I interpret it differently through my decade as worn-down caregiver. While Cupid's kiss reflects the power of Eros to redeem the loss and failure always implicit in Eros, certain experiences of loss and failure can also be unfixable and irremediable. The erotic antidote does not work. Creative self-transformations do not occur. Cupid, outside of myth, fails to show up just in the nick of time. Loss and failure, not amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, may be what Alzheimer's disease is all about for the entangled caregiver. Mere statistics that rank Alzheimer's among the leading causes of death serve to hide the unnumbered thousands of caregivers exhausted and distraught as a spouse or parent slowly slides into a protracted, unresponsive death in life. Some disasters over which we have no control may be slightly easier to accept than preventable losses and failures. My failures as a caregiver were sometimes, frankly, very preventable. Sheer survival as a caregiver may require such violation of principles and failures of best intentions that you cannot but emerge in your own eyes less. This is not the self-criticism of a crank perfectionist. At times, I just plain failed. Failure is preordained for caregivers of Alzheimer's patients. This note to self, which applies in other desperate medical conditions, might at least offer solace to fellow caregivers distressed or tormented by their deficiencies. Caregiving is like a game that you cannot win and cannot refuse to play, but it is also no game. It belongs to the awful paradox that caregiver Carl Levine calls accepting the unacceptable. Failure here is not an errative excuse with a heartfelt mea culpa or a Hamlet-like nod to human frailty. If you set high expectations for yourself, you will fall short. You will fall short anyway, period. I was ambushed a second time, less by Alzheimer's disease than by inescapable, irreparable failures. So let me work toward a conclusion. I'm setting up a distinction between two powers I'm calling medical logos and medical eros, and I think in some ways they've been almost reified over the last 100 years in what I would call these two basic medical mythic figures, Hippocrates and Asclepius. Almost every medical center I know will have somewhere a bust of Hippocrates you have to look hard to find Asclepius. But the differences are almost binary. Between human and divine, between age and youth, written, oral, scroll, snake. In other words, I think we've been in some ways engineered into a kind of situation of binary opposites, in which if you have one, you can't have the other. Just as if you have a 0, you can't have a 1, and if you have a 1, you cannot have a 0. They exclude each other. The resolution for me is that medical logos needs medical eros, and vice versa, medical eros needs medical logos. That we move in some way out of this cage of binaries that has been in some ways constructed for us. That eros and logos aren't binaries, but they're contraries, and I try to work a little bit with that distinction. Rain is contrary to sun, and sun is contrary to rain, but they're not opposites. The opposite of sunshine is not rain. The opposite of rain is not sunshine. You can have both. You can have an experience of illness that involves both the biological operations of illness and also a perception of a lived experience that also has a way in feedback loops of altering the experience of illness itself. That eros can help transmute the experience of illness and loss into a medium for healing, change, and renewal. And I guess I would argue that even though I left the reading on such a dark note of personal failure, that I'm here, I'm doing better. I was involved in starting a writing retreat in Taos, New Mexico. It's self-selected somehow that the particular session that I was coming back to do a reading to self-select a lot of psychiatrists. And so I read my section, and I expected to get some literary feedback in this writing, and they said, you really need some help. and they were just right. But so this is the moment when I actually get out of the Australian medical system. I passed my cardiac stress test, and let me tell you, if you don't pass the cardiac stress test, they send you 5 hours south by plane to get a stent or a bypass operation, and you really don't have a say in this. Yes, you can, I suppose, check yourself out of the medical system altogether, but they make it quite clear that if you get on a jumbo jet without the proper paperwork clearance, and the jumbo jet has to turn around because of your illness, that you will be charged the entire price of the turning around of the jumbo jet. So basically it's your house, your car, any material possession you have, down the drain. So in some ways, when you enter the medical system, you're in a system, and you're not any more a complete free agent than the physicians in that system are complete free agents. We're all working within constraints. And so that what I hope is the takeaway from this talk is whatever you think about desire and eros, is whenever you go abroad, please get travel medical insurance. It's saved my life in Australia. At 2 o'clock in the morning, swaddled with electrodes, they finally got me stabilized. 2 o'clock in the morning, a very well-dressed woman comes in from the business office and says, "May I inquire about your insurance?" So that is part of the inner life of just the experience of illness. Didn't have a lot to do with desire, except my desire to get out of Australia at that point was coming very much up against a medical system who was saying, no, you really don't have that freedom. I was pleased that there's both an individual application to this, I think, for individual healthcare workers can understand how in their practice desire might figure, but it also could figure somehow organizationally in terms of how medical schools operate or just create a curriculum. So I'm interested in Asclepius as somehow my sort of mythic figure for medical eros, and it was of interest to me that the AMA has adopted a new symbol. That at least I grew up in a physician's household, remembering the twin snake caduceus that reflected incorrectly Hermes as who had nothing, in fact, to do with ancient medicine. That it's always a single snake for Asclepius, and the AMA has finally come back to Asclepius as its major symbol. And many things that are good about the profession, and it's sort of says, not the least of which is continuity. So my hope would be that, in fact, those empowered in medicine to claim the continuity would, in fact, see in the image of the new AMA logo the continuity with Asclepius, with ancient medicine, with a pluralism of ancient medicine, which was both Hippocratic and Asclepian, and see that as the potential for a new direction. This is the end of the road, no more rest stops, but Ruth had done her doctoral dissertation on tables of contents, so this is my tribute to Ruth at the end, and also to give you a sense of the way in which the book moves, the kinds of subjects it takes. It's my favorite Disneyland ride was always Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, and it's always been the sort of patron, my patron as saint as a writer. So this is Mr. Toad's Wild Ride through Eros and illness, and hope we've got some time for some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for a wonderful talk, and I will also say it is a wonderful book. The table of contents and this talk are wonderful previews. UVA Bookstore is here right outside the upstairs entrance with copies of the book, and David is also willing to sign copies after the talk and take some questions up there as well. We do have several minutes for conversation with you. This talk has accented many different points, and we have people from many different areas here in the audience, and so I think there's an opportunity for a multifaceted conversation here. I will ask when you raise a question or ask a comment that you please identify yourself. So who would like to start?
My name is Bernie Beitman. I'm a psychiatrist in Charlottesville, and I've known Dave 60 years from high school.
Wow.
FYI, Yale medical students at least used to and may still have the pleasure each year of something called the Asclepian Frolic.
Do you know if that's still going on?
I hope it is. I think so the practice of medicine is such a difficult life to choose. And I know this because my father was an MD, and I got it around the family dinner table. But I think some Asclepian frolic is something we all need. And one of the, for an Alzheimer's caregiver, there is, in fact, the need for respite is so well understood that it is built into, I think, the Medicare system. What I discovered is that both myself and speaking to other caregivers, we resisted taking advantage of it. I think it was a mistake. I think that caregiving can be as difficult as the practice of medicine, and you won't be, as a caregiver, you won't be frolicking, but you just need a break. And if there's a possibility of someone you know who needs that, I would be glad to be the bearer of that message.
One of the medical anthropologists and psychiatrists, Arthur Kleinman, who you mentioned in your book, when he visited here a few years ago, he had also spent many years caring for a spouse with dementia. And his suggestion for a revision of health professional education, medical school or nursing school, included the suggestion that the students might start out learning custodial caregiving. What would you think of that?
Well, I think that's a good piece of it. Although maybe as a medical student, it's so early in your training that it doesn't hit home the way it might to someone who's older. There is a formula that I encountered that I called an erotic economy. And it may operate in many diseases differently. The way it operated in Alzheimer's disease was this, that as I got more and more exhausted and Ruth became more and more incapacitated, it's almost like a parent with a child. It's not like you love them more, but they get more and more of your time and your attention and your energy. So it became almost like a bank account that as this happened, I was sort of giving more and more affection just at the point that the trajectory of the disease was, that Ruth was less and less able to respond and had less and less emotion of her own to offer. So it was like a bank account that was being continually depleted, and there was nothing coming back in. So there may be different erotic economies that operate in different diseases, but this is a particularly difficult one that ought to be understood, I think, by people who are embarking on the career of caregiving for an Alzheimer's patient, that there will be a point at which what is given out on your side, nothing comes back in. So you need to predict that, I would say, and then figure out how you might address it. And perhaps it's with family or friends, but that sense that the emotional transaction within a marriage had suddenly gone haywire was part of my experience. I'm glad to get an opportunity to share that. I couldn't figure out how to get it into the talk.
Thank you for your talk on Ann Clementi. I'm one of the social workers here, and the population I work with the most are with brain tumor patients. And we do try to work closely with the caregivers because, not that there's any advantage to having an Alzheimer's, but the experience is a little bit slower when some of our brain tumor patients almost go into an instant Alzheimer's-like process. So we struggle with trying to get caregivers to take breaks. I would love some advice because often when I get back is, I'll take my break when it's done.
I think that was my thinking. And combined with a sense of responsibility to your spouse, there's no one who can take care of my spouse the way I can because I know my spouse. So a real reluctance. So how do you overcome that? That's a really interesting question. And from personal experience, just someone saying, take a break, doesn't work. So I would throw that question out wider to the whole group. It's one that I think is really important. How can you incentivize a kind of respite from the difficulties of protracted caregiving? Let's leave that as a problem and not say I've got a quick solution to it. I don't. But it does need to be incentivized somehow.
I think it's also a cultural issue of not being able to give yourself permission to do that because of everything that's staying with the chore.
Absolutely. I sometimes wonder, when it comes to interventions in alcoholism, people aren't given a choice. the intervention happens and you say, here's your ticket to this particular facility. It may be, here's your ticket for a weekend in Pittsburgh. Goodbye. We've arranged for the care. It may have to be that dramatic. And maybe if it happens once and the person experiences it as positive, that's, would be an interesting pilot study and interesting use of funds. Here's the ticket, go.
My name is Jody Esselstyn. I'm a family nurse practitioner and watched my father care for my mother who died of a brain tumor. I just wonder, did your caregiving strategy or approach change after your heart attack when you realized how fragile you were as a caregiver?
Just brutally stupid, I think is the way, because I really didn't even connect the two, because I thought I was fine. Why should I be having a heart attack? It really took working on the book to discover actually, now I know what was going on. So, yeah.
Why don't you just tell them you're okay now? I mean, it really didn't have anything.
4 years later, I'm fine.
And right afterwards, when you came back.
Well, with this sort of thing, it can be dealt with. And so I don't think of myself as a recovering heart attack patient, but I do think caregivers ought to know that that's an option out there. So tell me again, focus the question for me again. I've lost the thread.
Oh, I just wondered, did that wake-up call change your caregiving at all when you came home from that? Or was it a wake-up call at all? Maybe it didn't change.
I think some of us sleepwalk through certain kinds of really tough situations. It didn't change too much, no. Maybe inside each of us is that teenager who thinks, we're invulnerable. But certainly when a spouse is ill, you suck it up. It's your turn to be the one. And you just, it was easy for me to fall into that pattern.
Other comments and questions?
I do want to point out that Beitman was a very fine second baseman. And I think a damn fine psychiatrist.
In softball.
Beg your pardon?
In softball.
Any last thoughts that you have to share with us, things that you thought about including in the talk and thought there wouldn't be time?
Well, I have just been so impressed with the visual powers of biomedicine. It seems to me that this is the term that I picked up was the molecular vision of modern medicine. We can see things, we can see the interior of the body, and it can offer us information about possible disease trajectories as never before. But that visual power may prevent us from seeing other things. I mean, it makes sense. As one sense becomes sort of hyper activated, other senses might decline. And so my hope would be that as in fact we all become subjects of this molecular gaze, and in some cases as caregivers, practitioners of the molecular gaze, that we also think that there is this inner life of the experience of illness that doesn't show up on an instrument, for which there is no billing code, but may have very profound medical implications, as profound as a heart attack for someone who doesn't even know they're at risk.
It also occurs to me that medical errors might be, as you've suggested, ignored at its own peril, given that we have something of an epidemic of burnout or threatened burnout for health professionals, to disengage health professionals whose work is hard and demanding from their own inner life, their own, that kind of vital energy that brought them into the work in the first place and that holds them there despite often the difficulties. What would your thoughts be about ways to engage again that sort of energy, short of having snakes in the hallways of the hospital?
100 planes on highways.
Yeah.
I think, as I said near the start, that one of the difficulties is having a vocabulary. And the fine physicians I know would I think, have no trouble with what I presented as 5 pieces of evidence about the importance of desire and eros and the experience of illness. It's just, how do you talk about that? And so there have been dismissive vocabularies that have to do with bedside manner. That's not going to get you very far in a profession that has all kinds of demands of knowledge and time. But maybe if it turns out that medical logos and medical eros are terms that make some sense to people who are working in medical environments, and if they're valued as contraries that contribute to the process, then there's a way of addressing it inside medical centers. The one thing I'm trying to be very careful of not doing when I speak to a medical audience is giving advice about the practice of medicine. I think it's illegal, but certainly to practice medicine without a license. But I need to give advice about medicine without being a practicing physician yourself is very dangerous. So I think this is something for those inside the medical world to address. If that vocabulary works for them, it becomes then a way of taking it seriously and say, listen, we're working on one side of the equation, but there's another side of the equation as well. If you're doing math and you're working only one side of the equation, you're making a mistake. And so I think if the vocabulary is useful, I would hope it has the possibility of then sparking some good discussion.
Thank you. Well, I'm doing the math and we're out of time. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing this experience with us and your work. As well, for those of you who can join us next week, we have a program called Predatory Publishing, From Fake Academia to Real Extortion in Scholarly Publishing. And our speaker is Brandon Butler, who is the Director of Information Policy for the UVA Libraries. And those of you who get unwelcome solicitations for opportunities to publish your work that come through email and on the internet, please join us next week and learn what's behind all of this. Thank you so much, and thank you, Julie.